Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Service Organization Control Reports Review Training, commonly known as SOC Reports. My name is Alex Harold, and I'm an Administrator of Financial Management for the Office of Accounts and Control. So the idea behind this presentation is to continue to improve on both our review and documentation of the service organization's controls that the state relies on. To do this, the Office of Accounts and Controls has designed a new SOC report review template, which will be covered in detail in today's presentation and is available for download via the link sent to your email. For a more complete overview of the basics of SOC reporting, the presentation completed last summer is a great resource for that. Here's that presentation referenced on the previous slide. The June presentation is listed as a link here, so you can open it directly from this slide. There is also an audio component as well from that presentation, which was not linked here because it made the file extremely large and difficult to work with. However, there is a link to that audio that was sent to your email as well. So let's back up for a second, as you may be asking yourself, Alex, we already have a SOC checklist. Why are you making these changes? Is it because Accounts and Control has nothing better to do and wants to make my life more complicated? Well, maybe. But the real reason is that while the SOC checklist was an improvement from previous years, the state is still receiving an audit finding each year in this area. Not to mention that, hey, just like anything else, continued improvement in training is vital to success in any area. The report review template will help us accomplish that. It is essentially more like a memorandum and gives some vital information not included on the previously used checklist. Think of the report review as the SOC checklist, except it's working with a nutritionist and going to the gym 7 days a week. All right. It's an improved version of what was already there. And while it will take a little more work on the front end, it's going to save you time and hopefully remove an audit finding in the long run. So before we turn the page and get into all the excitement that is the SOC report review template, let's get a reminder on one of the key reasons we are revamping our SOC report documentation. Audit findings. Yes, the dreaded audit findings. In the area of SOC reporting, we have received this finding for multiple years, and it primarily relates to our overall consideration and documentation, or lack thereof in this case. Specifically, the Office of the Auditor General boils the finding down to two things. One, we don't document relevant user entity or state controls. And two, we don't thoroughly evaluate testing exceptions and/or modified opinions. We will get to the specifics on these findings in subsequent slides, but the take home here is this. The SOC report review will enhance your documentation and help to ultimately eliminate this audit finding going forward. All right, so let's get down to brass tacks here. What you see listed before you are all the key components your SOC report review will cover in its review of your relevant SOC report. I won't bore you with walking through each of them here. That's what the subsequent slides are for. But in any event, the key here is, you see that first component in the top left, the summary table? That's essentially what the checklist used to be. And while it's a large part of what we review and document, you can see there are now several more categories, some completely new, some just expanding upon what the checklist only briefly mentioned before. The devil is in the details, so let's dive in. As mentioned on the previous slide, this is the summary table, and it's the first section of data listed on the report review template. This gives the reader a 30,000-foot look into the most important data of the SOC report review process, such as what agency, what contractor, what activity, who reviewed the SOC report, the type of SOC report, and most importantly, the results of that SOC report and your agency's review of those results. A person reviewing this report review, whether it's someone from your agency, the Office of Accounts and Control, or the Office of the Auditor General, will be able to assess all the key information regarding the SOC report quickly and efficiently right here. But wait, there's more. I've got to say, I've secretly always wanted to say that. But with this new template, a reader will now be able to obtain more information regarding a particular data field here in the summary table. Purpose of report review. So look at this. I'll call this an easy win because you aren't tasked with doing any work here. However, the purpose portion of this template is an important piece of information, and we would be remiss if we didn't document it in the report review, and more importantly, understand the reason why we include this information. Given everything required with SOC reporting, it's sometimes easy to forget the most basic, yet incredibly important question. Why are we doing this? It's essential to helping you understand the information that will follow in the SOC report itself. Though it's probably the case that most people handling SOC reporting have a financial, accounting, or risk background, and may even be familiar with SOC reporting, that might not always be the case. Additionally, it's to everyone's benefit to include basic information that almost reads like an instructional pamphlet or one of those for dummy books. It's not really for dummies. At least that's what my wife tells me. In any event, it boils down to these three things. The agency relies on an organization for its services. The organization has those services audited, and the agency reviews that audit. SOC reports and types. Hey, whatever you were saying about me after the first few slides, you feel a little guilty now, right? Another section that doesn't require any input from the agency. But again, I stress that this is important to review and understand from your perspective. This slide covers both SOC reports and types. There are two separate SOC reports, 1 and 2. SOC report 1 is for service organizations that impact or might impact their clients' financial reporting, i.e. the income statement or the balance sheet. SOC report 2 is for service organizations that hold, store, or process information of their clients. However, these services are not significant to financial reporting. Both reports can have a type 1 or type 2 component. A type 1 report provides a list of procedures and or controls an organization has put in place as of a point in time. A type 2 report has an audit period and provides evidence of how an organization operated its controls over that period of time. If any of these reporting types or terminology don't make sense, please reach out to me at the Office of Accounts and Control. If I haven't stressed that enough yet, ANC is here to help with this process in any way we can. But rest assured, this isn't rocket science, and we can get you to a place where this makes sense and doesn't feel overwhelming. Having said that, the key here is that you should understand what SOC report and type you have so you can understand the requirements and expectations for what type of information you will be receiving. Agency user background. So this is the first step where you will have to fill out some information, but it should be easy. It's about you. The purpose of this section is to provide a brief summary of the agency and its mission. It's quick and easy, but again, it helps set the table for those reading this report review to have insight into how the agency fits in with this process. As you can see below, and from previous slides, I randomly chose the Department of Human Services and their contractor, Vendor X, as an example, and you will see these screenshots throughout the remainder of the presentation. As you may or may not know, I'm actually new to state service, and one of the things that is most prominent when you start a new job or maybe a new position is that there's sometimes no guideline or work instruction to help you get acclimated to your new situation. This is where a lot of this information was birthed out of. The idea that if you're new to this position of helping with SOC reporting, or you're passing the task off to someone else, this template, along with the instructions and this presentation, can help you get an understanding of what is going on, who the players are, and why the information is so important. State contractor service organization background. So the purpose of this next section is very similar to the previous one regarding the agency. Here we want to capture, albeit briefly, a summary about the state contractor and the service it provides. This information can typically be found within the SOC report itself, on the contractor's website, and perhaps even in the contract with your agency. Again, this helps provide context to the relationship between the agency and the service organization or state contractor. Activity background. This is the final section connecting the agency and the contractor. Now that there is background information on both the agency and the contractor, this section is meant to connect them via the activity or activities that the service organization or contractor provides to the agency. This can also be brief in nature, but key to this component is elaborating on what activities your agency is responsible for and what the service organization does to perform those activities. This just helps to put some meat on the bone for those who are reviewing and relying on this information, namely yourselves, the Office of Accounts and Control, and the Auditor General. Procedures performed and scope of agency's review. So again, nothing required in this section, but your agency should familiarize itself with the information listed here, as these are the main components required to be reviewed and documented as part of the SOC report review process. Most of the information required for these components is found within the SOC report itself, but there are a few items worth pointing out here. One of them is Independent Service Auditor, or ISA, credibility. This section is meant to be a background on the audit firm itself. We will get to the details on that particular slide, but you should be able to tell who the auditor is from the SOC report itself. And second, complementary user entity controls. Again, we will address this in more detail on that slide in particular, but this is one of the new key additions to the SOC report review. This is an essential part of the SOC reporting process in general, but it has also been documented extensively in the Office of the Auditor General's findings. This must be addressed, and this section of the SOC report review will help us get there. Covered by the SOC report. So, pretty simple documentation here, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. The SOC 1 report, type 2, is the most common SOC report where the testing is done over a period of time, typically 12 months, but at least 9. The period of year covered can vary, but it often results in a gap period related to the state's fiscal year end. If you're not sure what I mean by that, here's an example. Let's say that the SOC report covers April 1st, 2021 to March 31st, 2022. Since the state's fiscal year runs from July 1st, 2021 to June 30th, 2022, we have a gap of about 3 months not covered by the auditor's testing. This is a very common occurrence. We must then request from the service organization a bridge letter, which basically confirms that during this gap period, there were no changes or issues in the control environment. If there is, we should request additional details and work closely with the service organization to understand what the changes and issues were and whether they would affect the agency's control environment. As always, please reach out to me at the Office of Accounts and Controls when these situations arise. We can help guide you through any questions you may have. One thing of note, and I sort of came across this when I was helping wrap up SOC reporting for the 2021 fiscal year. There are definitely a few SOC reports that have testing that ends well before the state's fiscal year end, such as vendor X above. They end their testing on September 30th, 2021. So in the course of reaching out to one of those service organizations, there was some pushback from them on providing a gap letter for roughly 9 months. If you encounter this situation, please contact me and we can help resolve. At the end of the day, the service organization needs to meet our needs regarding SOC reporting coverage, whether by altering the testing period or agreeing to provide a gap letter regardless of the length of time. That's a difference between when they stop testing and when our fiscal year ends. Okay, off my soapbox, but just wanted to let you know that I am here to help you guys with this process. Qualifications on control objectives. So this is a big one. What is the opinion of the independent service auditor? This should really set the table for your agency and how critically you consider the results of the SOC report. If the SOC report has an unqualified opinion, it's reasonable to assume the agency can rely on the service organization's internal controls. That is not to say that the report shouldn't be reviewed thoroughly, no matter the opinion. There can still be exceptions in the testing period that would need to be assessed for whether they create any issues for your agency. Long story short, this should be where you document the opinion of the independent service auditor, as well as your agency's comfort level with that opinion. This can be a brief section overall. However, if necessary, it may make sense to reference other parts of the report review where specific testing is more detailed. To give an example, an unqualified opinion with no testing exceptions is going to be pretty cut and dry, right? You can basically state agency has a reasonable assurance it can rely on the controls of the service organization. However, in the case where there is, say, a qualified opinion or an adverse opinion, it may be reasonable to state the following. Despite the qualified opinion on the control objectives of the service organization, our agency is comfortable with the results due to XYZ. And maybe XYZ is the fact that the control issue isn't a significant part of what the agency does, or due to the agency's control environment. We have controls in place to actively mitigate the risk posed by the control deficiencies at the service organization. These are more commonly known as user entity controls, which we'll get into in more detail later. It's also okay to reach out if neither of these scenarios apply. If there is a qualified or disclaimer opinion, or even an adverse opinion, and you think your agency is at risk, it's time to alert the Office of Accounts and Control. Additionally, we may reach out to the Office of the Auditor General for guidance on how to approach this. At that point, it's more important to think about the risks to the control environment, more so than filling out the SOC report review. Independent Service Auditor background. This section provides a brief description of the independent service auditor's background. The purpose of this section is to review and document that the independent service auditor is both reputable and capable of performing the work required for the SOC testing. This information can often be found on the independent service auditor's website and sometimes on the SOC report itself. Service organizations included in the scope of the report. So, the purpose of this section is to review the SOC report to see if the service organization's internal controls, in order to be effective, are reliant upon a subservice organization's internal controls. This information is typically discussed in the independent service auditor's scoping paragraph because the auditors will make it a point to separate their audit of the service organization from any other entity that the service organization relies on for their internal controls. It's also not uncommon to see that the auditors mention that the other entity's SOC 1 report should be read in conjunction with their SOC 1. This subservice organization will also typically be mentioned in a section titled Complementary Subservice Organization Controls, which also give you some details on what the service organization relies on. You can see the below for vendor X as a prime example of this scenario, where the agency is reliant upon vendor X's EBT system and vendor X is subsequently dependent on their own separate ETS system. In this case, it would make sense for the agency to request and review vendor X's ETS SOC 1 report. I will preface that that it is not required to complete a whole separate SOC report review for the subservice organization. It should be sufficient to review the independent subservice auditor's opinion and document it in this portion of the SOC report review. So obviously, the biggest couple questions that will come up here are, is my agency SOC 1 reliant upon a subservice organization? And I would answer that with what I mentioned previously. Read through the SOC 1, specifically the areas of the auditor's scoping paragraph, as well as any sections dedicated to the subservice organization's information. If there is a specific indication from the auditors or the service organization itself that they rely on the subservice organization, aka they mention that you should review the SOC 1 for the subservice organization, then it's pretty clear you must request and review that SOC 1 report. The other question that might come up is, okay, I've requested the subservice organization SOC 1, and they have a qualified, disclaimed, or adverse opinion, anything other than a clean or unqualified opinion. Firstly, I'll state that in my time working with SOC 1 reports over the years, I haven't seen a scenario where the service organization has a clean opinion and a subservice organization they rely on has an unclean opinion. Logic seems to reason that there would be a trickle-down effect of that unclean opinion to both, and the state would have to address the unclean opinion from the very beginning of the SOC review process. But in the case that this does happen, I would review the service organization SOC 1 again, because perhaps there is a reason why they were able to mitigate any control issues experienced by the subservice organization. However, if this is not readily apparent, please feel free to reach out to me at the Office of Accounts and Control to discuss further. Any scope limitations described in the report. So, the purpose of this section is to review and document any scope limitations related to the SOC 1 audit. By now, you've probably realized that if there was a scope limitation, this would have most likely led to a less than clean opinion, which would alter the agency's consideration of its internal controls regarding the service organization. Again, in my entire SOC reporting life, wow, I sound cool, don't I? I have not come across a SOC 1 with any type of scope limitation, not to mention a significant one that might prevent the audit from even taking place. So usually, in practice, if you're receiving a SOC 1 report, it's most likely because the independent service auditor can conduct an audit of their internal controls without any scope limitations. But if you happen to run across a scope limitation in the SOC 1 report, and you think or are not sure if it could have an impact on your agency's internal controls, as always, you can contact me at the Office of Accounts and Control. Deviations noted in tests of internal controls by the independent service auditor. So this is another key section of the SOC report review, and it is an expansion on the SOC checklist previously used. In the past, agencies essentially checked boxes regarding exceptions and/or deviations. In the SOC report review, the deviations, the response to those deviations, and the agency's user entity controls are expanded upon in much greater detail, which you'll see in the next few slides. While there is more documentation in this new report, it's probably fair to say that this assessment was going on before at your agency, but this expanded detail will help your agency take more credit for the work it has done. Based on the audit findings, the lack of evidence of review and documentation has led the Office of the Auditor General to conclude the following: that the necessary analysis is not taking place. So the take home from this slide and the next few, not to mention this presentation overall, is that you want to take credit for the work you have done, and the only way to do that is to document, document, document. If anything, more is better in this case. So with that, this section requires you to document each deviation using the format below. So you'll essentially capture the control number, a brief description of the control, the deviation itself, and management's response, aka the service organization's response to that deviation. The descriptions of each part can be brief. The intent is to summarize what is on the SOC report and put it all in one convenient location. If the reviewer wants more detail, they can always reference the SOC report itself. But to have one document, the SOC report review, kind of stand on its own, will be valuable to you as well as the reviewer in saving time in what's covered overall in the SOC report. So this slide is just meant to show how brief my descriptions were for the deviations noted in the SOC report. So you know that it doesn't have to be a novel. Just get the key elements of the control as well as what is leading to the auditors giving it an exception / deviation here. So step back, you can see, again, a sentence or two, compared to, a lot of detail in the SOC report. Only necessary to give a couple of sentences. And I would be remiss, obviously, again, if I didn't say that, as you're going through these deviations, you should be thinking about what impact, if any, they have on your agency, as that's the next section of the SOC report review. Agency response to deviations. Okay, so you have now reviewed and documented the SOC report's exceptions and deviations, if any, and you are now ready to address them for the purposes of your agency. The responses and amount of detail in this section could vary, depending on the type of deviations you have encountered. In my example on the previous couple of slides, there were only 2 deviations, and they were relatively benign in terms of the risk to the agency. One was related to documentation for access, and overall, the access was authorized and appropriate. It was just that the documentation wasn't well kept. In the other case, accounts were excluded from a review process. However, the accounts that were excluded were not accessed inappropriately, so therefore there really wasn't any risk posed to the agency. And in both cases, management of the service organization had made it a point to clean up those errors and make sure they are not a risk going forward. And that's something you want to keep your eye on whenever deviations appear. Is management taking these seriously? Are they making an effort to clean this up for next year? If you don't see that, it could be a red flag and something to keep your eye on going forward into next year's SOC report. So given that, the response from the state here was pretty brief. Basically, the agency has reviewed the deviations as well as management's responses to those deviations, and essentially they're comfortable with that, are comfortable that these deviations will not have an impact on the agency's processes or internal controls. I also made mention that the agency itself has internal controls in place, and those would help mitigate any risk by those deviations. If there are more deviations or more significant deviations than my example below in your SOC report, it might require you to respond to each deviation separately here and note why or why not this deviation could have an impact on your agency. It may also make sense to note specifically which controls or processes at your agency help to mitigate the risk posed by the service organization's deviation. Which brings us to our next and probably most important section of the SOC report review. Complementary user entity, or as I like to call them, Q controls. Complementary user entity controls are something that the state must review and document better. When it comes to SOC reports, all of them have the caveat that certain controls and procedures must be in place at the agency for the agency's control objectives to be achieved. They are shifting the responsibility here to some extent, but it's ultimately true. At the end of the day, if the service organization has all its controls and processes buttoned up tight, and there are certain controls and or processes that are located only within the state, those controls and processes must be operating effectively. Otherwise, it's not going to matter what the service organization does. You know, it's the classic garbage in, garbage out. Essentially, both entities, the state agency and the service organization, have to be working together. So each SOC report is going to have controls that they have identified as being the responsibility of your agency. The goal will be for your agency to fill out the table in the SOC report to document the controls and processes in place. So the list of Q controls is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but it is a list of the controls the agency should consider having in place to meet their objectives. So it's obviously ideal if your agency has a control in place that lines up with each corresponding Q control. But it's very possible that your agency control covers multiple Q controls, and that's okay to fill this table out as such. If you're sitting and saying, oh boy, we don't have something in place for this Q control, that's okay too. It's part of the process of improvement, and hopefully it can help us identify an area that the agency can improve on. As always, you can reach out to me at the Office of Accounts and Control with any questions you have regarding these Q controls. But again, the goal is to address these Q controls and show that the agency has relevant and effective controls in place to complement the service organization. See the example below as a guideline. The response should be specific to the agency's control description or process. Again, the idea is if you can get your processes down, it will be much easier for you and any reviewer of this SOC report to feel confident that the agency has appropriately evaluated controls not performed by external parties. And keep this in mind as well. If there is a less than clean opinion or a particularly troubling deviation in your SOC report, the Q controls might be where you can say, okay, the service organization's controls had an issue this year, but due to the agency's controls, we feel we've mitigated any risk related to that control. You know, AKA if, say there was a fraud issue and your agency also has a set of procedures to prevent fraud, maybe that's enough detail to say, okay, we can mitigate this risk. I'm generalizing here, but these Q controls are part of the SOC report process, but they also come in handy when issues arise with a service organization that the agency relies on. So this is just a continuation of the previous slide. As I mentioned, there may be times where an agency control can cover multiple Q controls. On the flip side, you know, there may also be a Q control that, you know, isn't relevant to your agency's processes. And in that case, you know, you would just want to give a quick synopsis on why that control is not needed. And once again, I feel like I've mentioned it several times throughout the presentation, but please, please, please reach out to me should you have any questions. You know, you can, of course, reach out to me at my email, but I think it's best if you send, you know, any requests to the DOA.SOC reports and checklist email listed below. And last, but certainly not least, the disaster recovery section of the SOC report. While this won't require much work at all in terms of documenting, it's still very important that the agency have confidence that the service organization is able to protect the state's information in the event of a disaster. This is typically covered in its own section of the SOC report and will be lengthy in terms of its processes. But for us, it's just important that it's there and that we document that so it's easy for you and the reviewer to know that the service organization has a plan in place for the protection and recovery of the state's information. And finally, of course, it's time to take credit for the work you have done. Please make sure that you fill out the SOC report review completely do it once or twice over, and then you can print a PDF and sign and submit to the Office of Accounts and Control. The accompanying SOC report review template is in Excel and has instructions to the right of each section of the report to guide you. But as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me at the Office of Accounts and Control. So thank you for taking time to watch this video. We appreciate your assistance and continued improvement with the SOC reporting process. We know that this is, a little extra work, but we do believe that it will ultimately help to eliminate the audit finding and help improve the SOC reporting process overall. If you feel the need to shower me with praise or flowers or candy, just know that I'm a Reese's guy. But in all seriousness, I do appreciate you listening to this. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out.